Good afternoon. I want to welcome Speaker Frierson to this afternoon's meeting of the Assembly Committee on Legislative Operations and Elections. Madam Secretary, we do have a quorum present. Please mark Majority Leader Canizaro present when she arrives. And I'll skip the housekeeping measures because I think we all know those. If anybody has any questions, they can contact my office or our committee staff. With that, we'll open the hearing on Assembly Bill 441, and we're very, very lucky to have Speaker Frierson here. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and this is obviously the time where we have to be in 8 places at the same time, so I appreciate your patience. For the record, my name is Jason Frierson, Assemblyman for District 8 and Speaker of the Nevada State Assembly. Good afternoon, Chairman Orenshaw and members of this committee. I am here to present Assembly Bill 441, which serves as a mechanism to handle the financial and practical burden of appointed members of the legislature who are appointed shortly before or during a legislative session. As you all know, Nevada Revised Statutes 294A states that it is unlawful for a member of the legislature to solicit or accept any monetary contribution or solicit or accept a commitment to make such a contribution for any political purpose during a specified period of time before and after the legislative session. Generally, a legislator may not receive or solicit a contribution during the period beginning 30 days before and ending 30 days after the regular session, and 15 days before and 15 days after a special session. And we refer to this as the blackout period. Additionally, campaign funds may not be used for personal use, which is defined as an expense that would exist irrespective of whether that person was a legislator. However, many expenses, such as paying rent for living space in Carson City during the session, exist only because a person is a legislator. This expense qualifies as an allowable use of campaign funds. Serving in the legislature is an honor and a privilege, but I do not think it's lost on this body that we are a citizens' legislature doing the people's work with little compensation. Here in Nevada, our legislators earn $164.69 per day for the first 60 days of our session, which puts us in a salary range of $9,881.40 every other year. According to the National Conference of State Legislators, the average yearly salary for lawmakers across the country is $33,500. For us legislators, particularly those of us who represent Southern Nevada, we're focused to relocate 420 miles away from our districts to do the people's work with limited financial means. As a result, we are often forced to use our leftover campaign funds to meet the real financial burden of serving our state. Legislators who are appointed during a blackout period do not have unused campaign funds, and they are not able to accept or solicit monetary contributions during that blackout period. In these instances, the legislators personally pay for unreimbursed expenses that are required to move and maintain a living space in Carson City during session. With this reality in mind, this is why I brought AB 441 forward. Unfortunately, for those of us who have been here the last few sessions, we've lost several members in both chambers near or during session, and it became apparent that for those in particular who were appointed during blackout periods were forced to use personal income to serve as members of this body. According to NCSL, Nevada is one of 29 states that places restrictions on giving and receiving campaign contributions during a legislative session. 15 of these states have a general ban on all contributions, and 14 remaining only apply to a ban on contributions from lobbyists and or political committee contributions. A small number of states prohibit lobbyists from making campaign contributions at any time, including during a legislative session. AB 411 will allow legislative caucuses as well as fellow legislators the ability to contribute to an appointed member during the blackout period. In addition, the bill will give leadership in the majority and the minority caucuses the ability to assign BDRs of members who have left our body. I'll now walk through the provisions of the bill. Section 1 of the bill addresses what happens to bill drafts when a vacancy occurs after the general election and before the start of the regular session. If the vacancy is in the majority party, the Speaker or the Majority Leader may assign some or all of the former members' remaining BDRs to another member or standing committee. If the vacancy is in the minority party, the Assembly or Senate Minority Leader may assign the former member's BDRs to another member. The leaders must submit lists of the reassigned BDRs to the Legislative Council by the 8th day of session, and they may revise the list not later than the 15th day. Any reassigned BDRs are in addition to the BDRs a Senate or Assembly member would normally have. Section 2 has to do with campaign contributions for members who are appointed to fill a vacancy during the time when a legislator is prohibited from soliciting or accepting contributions, often referred to again as the blackout period. Under this bill, a member who is appointed may solicit and accept contributions during the blackout period from a legislative caucus or a fellow legislator only. Those contributions are also capped at $10,000 for a regular session and $1,200 for a special session. They may not be used to cover expenses other than the expenses for moving, travel, and housing that are over the supplemental allowance that they receive. Section 4 of the bill concerns the meaning of the term personal use of campaign contributions. Under existing law, it is unlawful for candidates and public officers to spend contributions for personal use. This bill specifies that personal use does not include paying for legislators' moving, travel, and housing expenses over and above the supplemental allowance they are entitled to receive. Section 5 addresses the disposal of campaign contributions. Under existing law, if a candidate is elected and has campaign funds they didn't spend or commit before the election, they must dispose of the money by returning it to their contributors, using it in their next campaign, contributing to another campaign, or other methods. AB 441 authorizes the candidate elected to the Senate or Assembly to dispose of campaign contributions by contributing to a member who is allowed under Section 2 to accept contributions because they were appointed to fill a vacancy. Section 6 through 9 are largely conforming changes. Section 10 is the effective date. The measure would take effect upon passage and approval. In conclusion, it's an honor to serve in this institution. But the reality is our appointed members make a significant sacrifice to be a member of this body with a very short notice. I think AB 441 is a reasonable measure to ensure we ease any financial burden to that process and ensure that we remove barriers that hinder those from serving this body. In general, you shouldn't have to be independently wealthy to serve in a citizen's legislature. And if you are fortunate enough and able to apply and be appointed to replace a legislator during that blackout period, that should not only be left to the wealthy. In the spirit of having a citizens legislature, we should be able to accommodate any person who's qualified and selected by the appointing authority to serve in this body without regard for whether or not they have the means independent of the resources from either other caucus members or caucuses to be able to serve. So with that, that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Speaker Frierson. I really appreciate the bill. We are so lucky when these vacancies occur that citizens in those districts are willing to step up, and I think that this legislation will make it even a little less difficult than it already is to try to step up and represent their community. Are there any questions for Speaker Frierson? Senator Severs-Ganser.
Thank you, Chair Orenshaw. And so we just got this bill, so I'm just kind of going through it here. You use the term organization whose primary purpose is to provide support for legislators, and then you mentioned caucus, but it doesn't really say caucus. And so there's all sorts of organizations that want to support legislators. So I don't know if that language needs to be tightened up or what that definition could look like.
Thank you for the record, Jason Frierson. To Senator Ganser, the intention is for it to be caucuses, and I think that the language was drafted with the request that caucuses and members be allowed to contribute, and again, it's capped at $10,000 total collectively from all sources. So the intention is most certainly to be only caucuses and individual members.
Thank you. And then Section 2 is a little confusing because one subsection tracks to another subsection, kind of back and forth. And so when I look at 2, it talks about a legislator shall not accept money contributions, et cetera, exceeding the $10,000 or the $1,200, which is it's broad language. So that piece of it does not restrict it to only folks who've been appointed. So does that mean that any legislator? And again, these sections are referring to each other, so I want to make sure that this is only for somebody who's been appointed and hasn't had the opportunity to raise some money, because they do have expenses that are outside the authorized amounts that are reimbursed.
Thank you again, Jason Frierson, for the record. The intention is for this to apply to new appointed members, not sitting members.
Right, and I'm not sure when in reading through this, because number 1 talks about the legislator who is appointed to fill, and it talks about subsection 1 of NRS 294A, right? So it's all about somebody who's been filling a position. But then when you get down to 2, the language is broader, and it's could potentially be applicable to any legislator. And then we get down to B, which limits how the funds can be spent, which makes sense. But 2 is broad, so I'm not quite sure if those are working together exactly right, or if that opens it up to other legislators who've not been appointed. So I'll have to ask legal about that.
Well, and if I may, I'd like to point out that if you look at Section 2, subsection 1, it says a legislator who was appointed to fill a vacancy.
Right.
And then you go down to subsection 2, it only says a legislator, but within the body of that, it back references to pursuant to subsection 1. And so I think at least in theory, both subsection 2A and 2B back reference pursuant to subsection 1, which expressly says a legislator who was appointed to fill a vacancy. So to the extent that legal would believe that that would need to be clarified, that is certainly the intent, but I believe that there's language in section 2, subsection A and B that back reference, as well as section 3, subsection 1, that expressly talks about a legislator who is appointed to fill a vacancy.
Yeah, so thank you. And so I'm seeing those references too, and so my thought was if it said 2, so we've got section 1, sub 1, section 2, sub 2, if it was a legislator pursuant to subsection 1, like shall not, colon, and then A and B, because they keep referring back and forth to each other, so it's kind of hard to see if section 2 to A is any legislator, or if it's tight enough to be just the person who is appointed to fill the vacancy.
I think
Or who does? Okay, so that was one of the issues, and then 3 again it talks about the legislator who's received contributions pursuant to subsection 1, which is at the top. So anyway, I think the idea in general is probably fine. The language is confusing. I just want to make sure that your intent is clear in both on the record and also in the document.
Thank you, Senator Severs-Gansert. And Mr. Fernley, may I reach out to you just to see if you feel there's your opinion, or if we feel we need to clarify any of the language?
Yes. So under current law, under NRS 294A 300, a legislator is prohibited from accepting contributions during a blackout period. Subsection 1 creates an exception that would authorize a legislator who is appointed to fill a vacancy during the blackout period to allow such an appointed legislator to accept contributions. Subsection 2 does not create an additional exception to accept monetary contributions, because it's referring to monetary contributions solicited or accepted pursuant to subsection 1. So the NRS 294A 300 prohibition on legislators during the blackout period would still apply. The only exception being legislators who are appointed to fill a vacancy during the blackout period.
Thank you, Mr. Fernley. Thank you. Appreciate that. Any, Senator Severs-Gansert?
I had one more question. So we're allowing individuals who are appointed to accept funds. Does that go? Does the $10,000 go against sort of the limits if they were to run a campaign? Because our campaigns kind of run, for the Senate every 4 years, and for Assembly members every 2 years. So if you've got an Assembly person who fills a position and then ends up running for election, they're typically in the same cycle. And so I don't know if someone donated $1,000, if that counts against the max $10,000 because it was done during this period.
I would defer to legal. I think, I say laypersons, even though I'm an attorney by day job, but the bill also requires that a person who is appointed return any unspent funds. So I guess I say that to say we're only talking about caucuses and individual members and their contributions. And so it would seem to me if that person who was appointed to fill a vacancy was subsequently going to run again or that would count. But I would certainly defer to legal.
And just to add to that question, since we all fill out standardized forms, right? We fill out the annual and then we do the quarterlies when we're actually running for election. It's almost, if they're going to accept money and then potentially spend or use the money, that almost requires a form if we're not going to put it on the regular, the annual and the quarterly reports. So it's something to consider.
And thank you. I believe this came up in the Assembly as well, and the individuals would have to file senior reports.
Thank you. And Mr. Fernley, could I reach out to you? And I consider myself a layperson too in this complex area of election law, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, my reading of the bill is that these contributions would be considered campaign contributions, and they would be reported in the same manner as any other contributions, campaign contributions, and subject to the same limits as other campaign contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fernley. Thank you, Senator Severs-Gansert. Any additional questions for Speaker Frierson? Vice Chair Lang.
Yeah, Brian, if I could ask you, so if they had leftover funds that they were going to return, then they'd report them in the same way like we would report a return contribution on our report?
Correct. Because these would be campaign contributions, the other provisions of law that apply generally to campaign contributions would also apply to these, so they would report those in the same fashion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernley. Any additional questions? Right, not seeing any. Thank you, Speaker Frierson, and we appreciate you presenting the bill, and if you have to run, we completely understand. But if you can stick around, we love your presence, but either way.
Thank you. I'll stick around as long as I can.
Okay, thank you, Speaker. With that, we will go to anyone else who wishes to speak in support of the measure. I don't see anyone here in the committee room, so broadcasting, if we can go to the phone lines.
Chair, the line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time in the queue.
Thank you very much, broadcasting. I will now go to opposition. Anyone who's opposed to the measure? Again, the committee room is empty. Is there anyone on the phone lines broadcasting?
Chair, the line is open and working. However, it is empty at this time.
Okay, thank you. And neutral. Anyone neutral on the measure? There's no one here in the committee room, so if we can go to the phone lines.
Yes, Chair, the line is open and working. However, it is empty at this time.
Okay, thank you, Speaker. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm missing one member, so we might have a work session later. I'm just trying to see if Majority Leader might be able to join us. But otherwise, we might. I'm just kind of waiting on hearing her. So thank you so much for presenting the bill, and we will go into a brief recess. Thank you. Committee members, we will come back to order, and we are very lucky to have Assemblywoman Sarah Peters here from Washoe County, and she is here to present Assembly Bill 365, so we will open the hearing on Assembly Bill 365. Thanks for joining us, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members. My name is Sarah Peters. For the record, I am representing Assembly District 24 in the heart of Reno. I'm here to present Assembly Bill 365. As I'm sure you know, a number of federal laws have been enacted to protect the rights of workers and those seeking employment. The first landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was followed by other statutes, including the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Uniformed Service Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, and several others. Nevada has incorporated these laws and expanded upon federal legislation in its own public policy to protect one's rights to seek, obtain, and hold employment without discrimination, distinction, or restrictions because of race, religious creed, color, age, sex, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, national origin, or ancestry. Subsequently, the state has adopted policies and practices to ensure fair hiring and employment practices that meet these federal and state standards, including investigation of complaints related to such matters. However, despite the state's proactive policies regarding discrimination in the workplace, gaps remain in our ability to gauge the effectiveness of these efforts in retaining a diverse workforce. Currently, there is no process for tracking or validating complaints associated with office-related culture that may be toxic or inhospitable to employees, particularly those with diverse backgrounds. Without this data, there's no way to track non-federally protected complaints or allegations to determine if a systemic problem exists or assess how to fix it. Additionally, there's currently no established standard for training regarding diverse employee retention and implicit bias. Our state has incredible diversity, as is reflected in this body. I often wonder why some state divisions continue to lack the diversity reflective of the state's population. We adopted hiring practices that are intended to increase diversity in applicants to state positions. However, we often continue to miss the mark as it relates to retention of employees with diverse backgrounds. It has been the policy of the state to direct non-federally protected complaints to the individual division's human resources or management to handle. And there has been no formal review of this process or the complaints and best practices policies implemented as a result of those complaints. In the last year, our country has been reflecting on disparities among people of color and their white counterparts. We have continued to see elevated disparities between women and men in the workplace, exacerbated by the conditions of the pandemic, but also reflective of the different needs of women in the workforce. Our state workforce has a history of being a place where people love to work, and retention was among the highest of any employment field. However, we are hearing from department after department that retention at the state is one of the biggest challenges our agencies are dealing with. Again, this got me to wonder why. I additionally reflected on my own challenges in the traditional work environment. I have been the primary provider for my family, requiring 3 maternity leaves, required flexibility to maintain my milk production during our nursing journey, again 3 times, while attempting to go back to work as normal, which includes mandatory travel to meet client deadlines, meetings scheduled during my pumping times, meetings scheduled at buildings that were not necessarily equipped to meet the needs of a pumping mother. I went to meetings and dinners and met deadlines when my body and baby wanted me to be home. Don't get me wrong, I had immense amounts of support from my boss and clients, and even employees of this state who offered accommodations multiple times. But it was an immense amount of effort to maintain normalcy in my job and for my growing family. Not everyone gets this level of support. It's not mandatory. Whether it's parents who need to pick up their kids or want to attend midday matinees of their child's pageant performance, whether it's someone trying a new hairstyle or dealing with undiagnosed health issues that get unsolicited questions or comments. These are unprotected scenarios that can result in passive-aggressive comments, actions, and attitudes, leaving the employee wondering why they want to work in such an environment at all. There are also issues of microaggressions. Microaggressions, to simplify, are defined as a statement, action, or incident regarding are regarded as an instant of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. These are sometimes subtle and often not recognizable to someone who lacks experience in identifying racial discrimination. Assembly Bill 365 declares that it is the public policy of this state that persons employed by the state be afforded respect, dignity, and equity in the workplace. The bill requires the departments of the state government to annually prepare and submit to the governor and the legislature a report concerning equity in the workplace, which includes a summary of each complaint filed by an employee which alleges conduct which is not unlawful but is against the declared public policy of the state, and any actions taken in response to such a complaint. The bill also requires the administrator of the Division of Human Resource Management to evaluate the effectiveness of any policy of the division intended to encourage equity in the workplace for persons of color and other persons of marginalized identities, and prepare and submit a report to the governor and the legislature concerning the results of the evaluation. Additionally, the bill defines a marginalized identity to mean an identity that causes or has historically caused a person of such an identity to be disproportionately subject to discrimination, harassment, or other negative treatment as a result of the identity. Finally, Assembly Bill 365 requires the Personnel Commission to adopt regulations for training of supervisors and managerial employees concerning implicit bias. I want to remind the body that just this last summer, we declared racism as a public health crisis and have self-reflective work to do to ensure that we are setting the standard as high in the state to be as anti-racist as possible. This bill is a small step in getting much-needed data to meet this goal, as well as the goal of retaining a high-quality, diverse workforce that feels supported and appreciated for the hard work they do to take care of our state. With that, Chair, I am open for questions.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. Thank you for presenting the measure today. Members, are there any questions for Assemblywoman Peters? Senator Severs-Ganser.
Thank you, Chair Orenshaw. So I'm trying to figure out what that report or the process looks like. So right now, there's not a process to be able to file a complaint. I mean, there's a process for a complaint that is a lawful complaint, but not one that's kind of outside those boundaries. And so that, and then I don't see anything about, I see some confidentiality in there, but I don't see anything about retaliation to make sure if someone is saying, I don't like how they're talking to me, they're doing disrespectful, whatever, how do you file that? How do you make sure that person's protected?
Thank you for the question. Sorry. Assemblywoman Peters for the record.
Oh, yes, and you can go directly to the senator. I just want to let you know you don't have to go through the chair.
Thank you so much, Chair. Sorry, the run got me a little bit. So you're right, there's no formal process. It is an adopted process, or maybe an adopted process in each division on how they manage complaints that are not those Title, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, like Title IX complaints, the federally protected issue areas. We want to kind of bring consistency across the board on how those complaints result in policy changes that potentially result in better culture, less toxic culture in some scenarios. I think one of the things that I see in here is that if we don't elevate the conversation, we don't change our attitude about it. What I want to try and do here is elevate those complaints that come in that have to do with the culture to a place where we're actually talking about culture change rather than saying we don't have a problem here because it's just one complaint. I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but in this bill, we would continue to have those processes be controlled by each division for how they handle them in-house. Those complaints and the resulting policy changes and implementation would then be elevated to the Division of Administration's HR department for evaluation to see if that's a policy we want to implement across the state, if it worked, and what we want to do with it next.
Thank you. So I laud the idea of what you're trying to accomplish, but because this all ends up in a report, it seems like there should be a a formal process so that it's apples to apples, so each division actually has the same sort of reporting form or guidelines, because in the end, you want to compile them, and you want to make sure those people are, their names are confidential, or, I can't remember, you didn't use the term confidential, it was a different term, or not revealed. So, in section 2(3), it talks about reported in a manner that does not reveal the identity of any person. So you might want to consider formalizing the process and also providing protection so there's no retaliation. But that's not in here right now. And I think it's going to be really difficult to compile information when the direction is pretty loose. Like you've got some boundaries about what you want to look for, but not exactly how to call it out and how to report it, and then how to protect people, and then how to, other than requiring it in eventually a report. So I'm not sure how you want to approach that, because the language is kind of broad and doesn't sort of give the directions on how you get there.
Thank you again for the comment, and to kind of circle back around, we don't call it out specifically in this bill. I'm sorry, Sarah Peters for the record. We don't call it specifically out in this bill, but the state is migrating to the Smart 21 system, which is an online HR system that has the capacity to take on a node that would be able to take these comments and then keep those confidential, those names confidential in those comments, but allow for us to aggregate them on the other side. That just hasn't been built out yet of the Smart 21 system. It is the intention in conversations I've had with the Division of Administration that they want to do that piece. I didn't want to be too prescriptive in here, though, because we don't know what that build-out will look like, and it would add a fiscal note if we mandate that build-out.
One thing I wonder, I'm not sure how it might interplay, but some of the work that is in Senate Bill 51, I wonder if some of that would apply here. So maybe there wouldn't be a need to add any language to this bill, because I think some of those protections for someone who's complaining about harassment that are in, there's a bill here that came from the Department of Administration that's actually being heard over in the Assembly Elections Committee this afternoon. And I know that Senator Ganser, we all worked on that, trying to protect someone who's been a victim. So maybe that would apply here as well, some of that language in terms of the interplay of all the statutes. Maybe I'm just kind of thinking out loud.
So Mr. Chair, I would agree with you, but this could also be something that would potentially be amended into that. But I think concerned about the lack of process, and then also protections, and then also there's no so if it's something that is against the law, there's an investigation process, because you actually could have someone who does a lot of reporting just because they want to get back at somebody, right? And it's not investigated, it's not followed up. It becomes sort of a hash mark almost, that this was reported. And so then if you have false claims that aren't investigated, that's sort of another issue potentially with it.
That's a good point. Well, I appreciate your comments, Senator Sievers-Cancer. Any additional questions, comments? Senator Buck.
Thank you, Chair Arnshaw. I was just wondering, how you're going to actually quantify how people make you feel. It just seems subjective.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Sarah Peters for the record. You're right, and that's part of the reason why we haven't done anything like this before. I want to kind of pull. So the goal of this bill was not to be punitive, right? Because we have processes for those investigations, for redirecting people who may have overstepped a line in a protected way. This was for scenarios like a woman wearing her natural hair and someone reaching out and just touching her hair or commenting on it in an inappropriate way that's not necessarily protected, but makes her feel uncomfortable. And collecting the data to see if, as a state, we need to direct implicit bias training or other management style trainings towards particular areas to help reestablish the culture of our agencies. Not to be punitive, because I think a lot of times people don't realize maybe that it was a problem, right? But becomes a problem for another person. And so in collecting that and in directing those to kind of aggregate and see if we see trends, we can then assess that for future work. One of the problems that I see right now is that it's oftentimes just dismissed as a one-off, right? Like, it was just a thing that was said. It probably didn't mean anything. When we start to see trends in those kinds of scenarios occurring, then we know we have a problem and something has to be done about it. Again, these are unprotected scenarios, right? So it doesn't get into the issues of sexual harassment or other harassments that are protected. It's really just the, like, I want to be able to come to work and be who I am, right, without someone else bombarding me with their biases about how I present myself here, or the things I have to bring with me because I've got kids at home, or those kinds of things. And again, just kind of getting at the what do we want our culture to look like, and how do we get there?
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. Any additional questions? All right. Any additional questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for presenting the measure. And with that, I will go to support. There's no one in the committee room, but broadcasting, if there's anyone on the phone lines in support.
Chair, the line is open and working. However, the public comment and testimony line is empty at this time.
Thank you. We'll now go to opposition. Anyone who's opposed to the measure. There's no one in the committee room, so broadcasting, is there anyone on the phone lines?
Chair, the line is empty at this time.
Neutral. Anyone neutral? There's no one in the committee room. Anyone on the phone lines?
Chair, the line is empty at this time.
All right, thank you. Assemblywoman Peters, any closing comments? We appreciate you being here and your flexibility in our crazy schedule today.
Yeah, if I may, Chair, thank you, Sarah Peters, for the record. I just want to make it explicitly clear that I love this state, and the people who work for this state, I think, are some of the biggest-hearted people and most well-intended people that I've ever met. I want our state to, again, be the pinnacle of career aspirations. And that's really difficult in a time when we're asking for people to come in from varying backgrounds who don't quite know what the culture looks like here. So the goal of this bill is really to try and place on ourselves the obligation to be as open and compassionate as an entity as we can be. And I think that our employees are more than capable of stepping up to meet that goal. And I look forward to seeing what we can do with this and what our state employee base looks like in the coming years.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sponsoring the measure and presenting it here today. And I'm a little short on committee members today, so as I told the speaker, we may be work sessioning later today, but I'm not sure. But we will let you know if we do decide to work session it. Thank you for presenting the bill today. And with that, members, I think we will go into recess and probably be at the call of the chair if members have other work they need to do or go to their office. Oh, hold on one second. I should do it now. This case, okay. And before we go into that recess, thank you, Director, for reminding me, broadcasting public comment. There's no one here in the committee room to make public comment, but if we could look to the phone lines in case someone would like to make public comment, just make sure we get them on the record.
Chair, the public comment line is open and working. However, the lobby is empty at this time.
Thank you, broadcasting. With that, members will be in a brief recess at the call of the chair. And if it turns out we're not going to have a work session, I will just come in and gavel us closed, so you don't have to come back. But if we do, I'll try to get everybody back quickly. Thank you.
Chair, you are unmuted to broadcast and may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. I want to bring the committee back to order. With that, we will be having a meeting tomorrow, and we are adjourned.